The newspaper clipping burned in my hands. A 1998 kidnapping victim with my birthmark. My father's smile twisted as he lunged, the handyman blocking the attic door. The social security number on my phone wasn't mine. It belonged to a dead child. I'm holding proof my parents stole me. The attic floor creaks behind me. They're coming. The attic air was thick with the scent of cedar and the heavy, stagnant breath of decades. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light piercing the vents, swirling like miniature galaxies in the wake of Ethan Miller's movements. He shoved a stack of mildewed encyclopedias aside, the rough buckram scraping against his skin, until his fingers snagged on the rusted latch of a heavy cedar trunk. The hinge shrieked, a high-pitched protest against the intrusion into its silence. Inside, nestled between moth-eaten wool blankets that smelled of camphor, lay a yellowed scrap of the Daily Gazette dated July 14th, 1998. The headline hit him like a physical blow. Vain air vanished without a trace. Below it sat a grainy photograph of a toddler with wide, startled eyes. Eyes that looked back at Ethan with a terrifying familiarity. He traced the ink-stained edges of the clipping, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As he reached the second paragraph, his breath hitched. The text described a distinct, heart-shaped mark on the boy's left collarbone. Ethan dropped the paper as if it had turned into hot coal. His hand trembled, fingers fumbling with the collar of his t-shirt, yanking the fabric downward until the mirror propped against the rafters caught his reflection. There, stark against his pale skin, sat the crimson smudge. It curved into a perfect anatomical heart, identical to the description of Julian Vane. The world tilted. Every birthday candle he had ever blown out, every "I love you" from the people downstairs, curdled into a lie. He folded the paper into a tight square, the sharp corners biting into his palm, and shoved it into his pocket. Downstairs, the muffled chime of the microwave signaled his mother's lunch was ready. "Ethan, did you find those holiday decorations yet?" Martha's voice drifted up the narrow stairs, cheerful and suffocatingly familiar. "Almost, Mom," he croaked, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew he couldn't stay. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage built of forged memories. Ethan scrambled toward his bedroom, his mind a frantic hive of calculations. He needed to move. He needed to be gone before the domestic rhythm of the Miller household resumed its crushing weight. He grabbed his worn leather backpack from the corner, the zipper rasping in the quiet room. He reached into the back of his closet, pulling out his passport and a small, tattered stuffed rabbit named Barnaby, a toy he'd had for as long as he could remember, its fur matted and gray. He was halfway to the door when the floorboards in the hallway groaned. Ethan froze, his thumb instinctively rubbing his index finger in a rhythmic scritch-scritch against the rabbit's ear. 1, 2, 3. He counted the steps in his head, a habit designed to keep the world from shifting under his feet. The door creaked open. Howard Miller stood in the frame, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expensive silk tie straightened with mathematical precision. He didn't smile. Usually, Howard's face was a mask of paternal warmth. But today, his eyes were hard, unblinking glass. He looked at the bag in Ethan's hand, then at Ethan's pale, sweating face. "Going somewhere, son?" Howard's voice was low, vibrating with a predatory edge that Ethan had never dared to acknowledge before. Howard reached out, his hand gripping Ethan's shoulder. The fingers didn't just rest there. They dug in, the pressure bordering on a bruise. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or perhaps you've just been digging where the ground is soft." I was just going to the library," Ethan lied, his voice trembling. "For my research project." The restoration blueprints. Howard's eyes flicked to the tattered rabbit in Ethan's hand. With Barnaby? You haven't touched that thing in years. He stepped further into the room, his vulture-like silhouette stretching across the floor. Martha is making sandwiches. I think it's best if you put the bag down and come downstairs. We have things to discuss. Important things. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was being pumped out by a vacuum. Ethan felt the weight of the newspaper clipping in his pocket. He knew if he stayed, the truth would be buried again, deeper this time. I can't, Ethan said, his voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. He tried to step past Howard, but his father, the man he had called father for 25 years, didn't budge. He was a wall of tailored wool and cold intent. Ethan, Howard whispered, and the sound of the silk tie rustling as he straightened it for the third time. Once for the knot, once for the length, once for the tuck, sent a jolt of pure electricity through Ethan's spine. It was the signal. The lie was coming. Move, Ethan commanded. The tension snapped. From the hallway, a heavy set of boots thudded against the carpet. Scott Weaver, the handyman Howard kept on a permanent retainer, appeared behind Howard. Scott was a mountain of a man, his knuckles scarred and his eyes dull. He smelled of grease and cheap cigarettes. Mr. Miller? Scott asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. Problem? My son is feeling unwell, Scott, Howard said, his grip tightening on Ethan's arm until Ethan winced. He's confused. Help him back to the bed. Ethan didn't wait. He swung the heavy backpack, the corner of his laptop inside slamming into Howard's ribs with a dull thud. Howard gasped, his grip loosening just enough for Ethan to wrench free. But Scott was already moving, his large hands reaching out like iron clamps. Ethan lunged toward the small desk in the corner, grabbing a thick architectural history book, a 5-pound slab of paper and glue. He hurled it at Scott's face. The book caught the handyman across the bridge of his nose. A sickening crunch echoed in the small room, followed by a spray of crimson that dappled the white wallpaper. Scott roared, clutching his face, but Ethan was already diving through the gap. He scrambled into the hallway, his heart hammering against his teeth. Ethan, stop! Martha's voice shrieked from the bottom of the stairs. She was standing there, her silver-plated mirror clutched in her hand, her eyes wide and watery. The floral scent of her perfume rose up the stairwell, cloying and sweet like a funeral parlor. Ethan didn't stop. He vaulted over the railing of the first few steps, his boots hitting the hardwood with a jarring impact. 89, 90, 91. He counted the steps as he lunged for the front door. He could hear Howard shouting behind him, the sound of Scott's heavy boots recovering, the house itself seeming to groan in anger. He ripped the front door open, the humid Seattle air rushing into his lungs. He sprinted for his truck, fumbling with the keys, the metal biting into his sweaty palm. He threw the truck into reverse just as Scott emerged from the front porch, blood dripping from his chin. Ethan floored it, the tires screaming against the asphalt, leaving the house of mirrors behind in a cloud of blue smoke. He drove blindly for 20 minutes, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the wheel. He eventually pulled into the parking lot of a public library, a squat brick building that promised the anonymity of silence. He needed data. He needed to know if the heart on his chest was a birthmark or a brand. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with a jagged, uneven rhythm that made his head throb. He found a terminal in the far corner, tucked away from the librarian's watchful gaze. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He didn't look for Julian Vane yet. He looked for Ethan Miller. He pulled up the state's digital records, bypasses he'd learned during his restoration work, looking for the foundation of his own life. He typed in his social security number. The screen flickered, a spinning circle of white light mocking him. Then, the text appeared. Record found, Ethan James Miller. Deceased, October 12, 1998. Cause of death, sudden infant death syndrome. Ethan stared at the screen. The air smelled of old paper and ozone. He wasn't just a kidnapped child. He was a ghost living in a dead boy's skin. The Millers hadn't just taken him. They had erased him and replaced him with a tragedy they couldn't face. He felt a coldness spread from his chest to his limbs, a numbness that made the counting in his head grow louder. 110. 120. He sat there for a long time, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes, until the realization of his own non-existence began to settle. He reached into his bag, his hand brushing against the matted fur of the stuffed rabbit. As he pulled his hand away, he felt something hard beneath the fabric of the toy's belly, a small rectangular lump that shouldn't be there. He pulled Barnaby out and ran his fingers along the seam. There, hidden deep within the polyester stuffing, was a tiny, hard plastic casing. He ripped the stitching with his teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A small black device fell into his palm. A light on its side blinked a steady, rhythmic red. A GPS tracker. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. They hadn't just raised him. They had curated him. Every trip to the park, every late-night drive, every moment of privacy had been broadcast back to Howard's phone. He wasn't a son. He was a tagged animal in a gilded cage. He looked at the blinking red light and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated loathing. He smashed the device onto the library floor with the heel of his boot, the plastic shattering with a satisfying crack. But the damage was done. They knew where he was, or at least they knew where he had been 5 seconds ago. He scrambled out of the library, his mind racing. He needed to get to Seattle. He needed to find Thomas Vane. But as he reached his truck, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a news alert, a local bulletin pushed to every device in the county. Silver alert. Authorities are seeking Ethan Miller, 25, in connection with a violent domestic assault. Miller is considered mentally unstable and may be off his medication. If seen, do not approach. Call 911 immediately. Howard had weaponized the world against him. In one move, his father had turned his quest for truth into a manhunt for a madman. Ethan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had no identity, no legal standing, and now, no safety. He was a ghost being hunted by the people who had murdered his past. He drove through the rain, avoiding the main highways, his eyes darting to every police cruiser he passed. The city of Seattle loomed in the distance, a jagged skyline of steel and glass draped in mist. He felt like a rat in a maze, but for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where the exit was. He ditched the truck in a muddy lot behind a Greyhound station, the smell of diesel and wet pavement filling his lungs. He began to walk, counting every step, his head down, his hood pulled low. Step 482. 483. He was cut off by a shadow. A man stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. It was Lawrence Griffin, a man Ethan recognized from Howard's business dinners. A private investigator with a twitchy nose and eyes that never stopped moving. 42. Griffin muttered, looking up at the sky as if counting the clouds. That's how many minutes I've been waiting for you to show up at this specific coordinate, Ethan. Get out of my way, Lawrence, Ethan said, his hand sliding into his pocket, gripping a heavy metal flashlight he'd taken from the truck. Can't do that. Howard wants you home, He's worried. Martha's been crying for 3 hours. It's a real mess. Griffin stepped forward, a taser crackling in his hand, the blue sparks illuminating the grime on his face. Ethan didn't hesitate. As Griffin lunged, Ethan swung the flashlight. The heavy casing connected with Griffin's wrist, sending the taser skittering across the wet pavement. Griffin hissed in pain, but he was fast. He tackled Ethan, the two of them slamming into the side of a container with a boom that echoed like a drum. The fight was desperate and ugly. Griffin clawed at Ethan's eyes, his breath smelling of stale coffee. Ethan drove his knee into Griffin's stomach, then slammed the flashlight into the man's temple. Griffin slumped, his eyes rolling back as he slid down the metal wall. Ethan stood over him, gasping for air. He didn't think, he just acted. He reached into Griffin's pocket and pulled out a set of car keys and a thick leather wallet. He found a black sedan parked a block away, Griffin's car. He climbed in, the interior smelling of new leather and old secrets. He checked the GPS. The last searched address was 1402 Highland Drive, the Vane estate. He drove through the winding streets of Queen Anne, the houses growing larger and more imposing as he climbed the hill. Finally, he saw it. A massive stone manor, its windows dark, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that looked like a row of black spears. The Vane estate didn't look like a home. It looked like a tomb. Ethan climbed the fence, the cold iron biting into his palms. He dropped onto the manicured lawn and sprinted for the porch. A rhythmic drip-drop from a clogged gutter hit the stone steps, sounding like a hammer blow in the damp air. In the center of the porch sat a child's tricycle, pristine and red, a haunting relic in a house where no child had lived for 20 years. He pounded on the heavy oak door. "Thomas Vane, open up, please." The door didn't open. Instead, a window to the left slid up. The cold barrel of a shotgun poked through the gap, the steel glinting in the porch light. "Get off my property," a voice growled. A voice that sounded like gravel grinding together. "I don't care who sent you. I don't have any more money. Tell the Millers the well is dry." "I'm not here for money," Ethan shouted, holding his hands up. "My name is Ethan Miller, but I think I'm Julian. I have the birthmark, Thomas. Look at me." Subverted beat 2.6. Thomas Vane stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun still leveled at Ethan's chest. He was a broken man, his face a map of grief and bitterness, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them for a week. He didn't look at Ethan with hope. He looked at him with a weary, murderous loathing. "Julian is dead," Thomas spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. "He's been dead for 20 years. You're just the latest in a long line of vultures." "How many of you are there? 5? 10? Every year someone like you shows up with a fake story and a sob tale, looking for a piece of the Vane fortune." "No, you don't understand," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. "I found the clipping. I have the heart mark on my collarbone. I have the rabbit, Barnaby." "Shut up!" Thomas roared, the sound echoing off the stone pillars. "You think I don't know how this works? The people who took my son, the people who have been sending me those goddamn ransom notes for 2 decades, they keep records. They sell the details to scammers like you. You probably bought that rabbit on eBay. You probably had that mark tattooed on by some back alley hack." Ethan felt the world crumbling. This was his last hope, the one person who was supposed to recognize him. And Thomas Vane was looking at him like he was filth. "I'm not a scammer. I grew up in a house of lies. I just want the truth." "The truth is that you're a parasite," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're working for them. You're here to soften me up before the next demand comes, aren't you? Well, it won't work. I've spent 20 years circling this block, refusing to turn left because I thought it would change the past. I'm done. If you don't leave this porch in 5 seconds, I'm going to do what the police should have done years ago. Ethan stared into the dark hollow of the shotgun barrel. He had escaped the Millers, fought a private eye, and crossed the state, only to find that his biological father was his most dangerous enemy. He wasn't being welcomed home. He was being hunted by both sides of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. He felt a wave of devastating exhaustion wash over him. He was a ghost, and it seemed the world was determined to make it official. 5, Thomas counted. Ethan didn't move. He didn't count his steps. He just stood there, the rain soaking through his shirt, feeling the cold weight of a life that belonged to no one. 4. Look at the mark, Ethan whispered. Just look at it. 3. Ethan grabbed the collar of his shirt. With a violent jerk, he ripped the fabric down, exposing his left collarbone. The porch light hit the skin, illuminating the crimson heart. It wasn't a tattoo. The edges were soft, the color deep and organic, a part of his very fiber. Thomas paused. The shotgun barrel dipped an inch. He stepped closer, his breath hitching in his chest. He reached out a trembling hand, his thumb, calloused from years of rubbing his wedding ring finger, brushing against the skin. The rain continued to fall, a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, as the two men stood there in the flickering light, the silence between them filled with the ghosts of 20 years. "Julian?" Thomas whispered, the word barely a breath. The shotgun clattered to the stone floor. Thomas slumped against the doorframe, his face contorting as a sob tore through him. Ethan caught him, the two of them sinking to their knees on the cold porch. The smell of wet wool and old grief enveloped them. "I thought you were a lie," Thomas choked out, his hands clutching Ethan's shoulders with a desperate, bone-crushing strength. "I thought everything was a lie." "It was," Ethan said, his own tears blurring his vision. "But this is real." They sat there for a long time, the rain washing away the grime of the journey. Finally, Thomas stood, his movements stiff and slow. He led Ethan into the house, a place that felt like a museum dedicated to a 3-year-old. Julian's room was exactly as it had been in 1999. The primary colors of the wallpaper faded, a wooden train set frozen on its tracks, the air smelling of dust and preserved hope. They went into the study, a room lined with leather-bound books and filing cabinets. Thomas went to a safe in the corner and pulled out a stack of envelopes. "These came this morning," Thomas said, tossing them onto the desk. Ethan picked one up. The paper was cheap, the address printed in block letters. He opened it and read the single line inside. "The boy is restless. The price for silence has gone up. Pay by Friday or the truth comes out." Ethan stared at the handwriting. It was familiar. He'd seen it on 1,000 grocery lists, on good luck notes in his lunchbox, on the back of childhood photos. "This is Howard's handwriting," Ethan whispered. "What?" Thomas leaned over, his eyes narrowing. "My Howard Miller. He didn't just take me. He's been blackmailing you for the privilege of keeping me." Ethan felt a cold rage bubbling in his gut. Howard wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a parasite who had been feeding on Thomas's grief for 20 years while pretending to be a pillar of the community. He sent them to himself, too, Ethan realized, his mind racing. He'd show me anonymous threats to keep me afraid, to keep me from asking questions. He was playing both sides of the board. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The house was plunged into a thick, velvety darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic thud-thud of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The clock with no hands. "The power's out," Thomas said, his voice tight. "No," Ethan whispered, his heart skipping a beat. "They're here." A window shattered downstairs, a sharp, crystalline sound that echoed through the empty halls. Then came the heavy, measured footsteps of someone who didn't care about being heard. "Ethan, Julian, it's time to come home now." Howard's voice drifted up the stairs, calm and terrifyingly reasonable. It was the voice he used when he was about to win a case. Ethan and Thomas retreated into the library, the smell of old paper and wood polish surrounding them. Ethan gripped the metal flashlight, his only weapon. They crouched behind a heavy oak desk, their breathing shallow. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the rows of books like a searchlight. Then, the door creaked open. Howard stepped into the room, followed by Scott Weaver, whose face was now a mask of bandages and dried blood. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Ethan," Howard said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Martha's very upset. She's waiting in the car. She wants to go to Thanksgiving dinner." "You're a monster, Howard," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I know about the notes. I know about the deceased infant. I know everything." "Knowing isn't the same as proving," Howard said, stepping closer. The silk of his tie rustled. 1, 2, 3. "In court, the truth is just a story told by the person with the best credentials. And right now, you're a mentally unstable fugitive who assaulted a handyman and a private investigator. Who do you think the judge is going to believe?" "Me," a new voice said. Martha Miller stepped into the room from the shadows of the hallway. She looked frail, her floral perfume so strong it was sickening. She was clutching her silver mirror, her eyes darting around the room like trapped birds. "Howard, stop it," she sobbed, the click-clack of the mirror opening and closing filling the silence. "It's over. He knows. They know." "Martha, go back to the car," Howard commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "I can't," she shrieked. "I can't look in the mirror anymore. I see a monster, Howard. I saw that little boy in the park and I wanted him so much. I watched them for months. I watched Thomas take him to the sandbox. I watched him turn his head. It was so easy. You said it would be okay. You said you'd handle the police." Thomas let out a low, guttural growl of pure agony. "You stalked us? You planned it?" "She was grieving, Thomas," Howard said, his voice devoid of any empathy. "She needed a son. I provided one. And you provided a very comfortable lifestyle for us over the years. It was a fair trade." Ethan felt a wave of nausea. His entire existence had been a transaction, a way for Howard to exert power and Martha to soothe a wound she refused to heal. "I have the ledger, Howard," Ethan said, reaching into the bag he'd taken from Griffin's car. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "I found it in Griffin's briefcase. 20 years of payments to Detective Richard Bennett. 20 years of bribes to bury the Vane case. It's all here, every cent." Howard's face transformed. The mask of the concerned father fell away, revealing the predatory vulture beneath. He lunged toward Ethan, but Scott was faster. The handyman grabbed Ethan by the throat, his massive hands squeezing the air from Ethan's lungs. "Give it to me," Howard hissed, reaching for the ledger. Thomas Vane didn't hesitate. He swung a heavy brass lamp, catching Scott across the temple. The handyman grunted and collapsed, his grip on Ethan's throat loosening. Ethan fell to the floor, gasping for air, the world spinning in shades of gray. "Run, Ethan!" Thomas shouted. But it was too late. The front door of the mansion burst open. Blue and red lights strobed against the library windows, casting jagged, rhythmic shadows across the walls. "Police! Hands in the air!" Subverted beat 3.6. Ethan felt a surge of relief. Finally, the authorities were here. He held up the ledger, his voice raspy. "Officer, over here. I have evidence of a kidnapping and bribery. This man, Howard Miller. Get down on the ground, now!" The lead officer barked, his service weapon leveled directly at Ethan's chest. Ethan froze. "Wait, no. You don't understand. I'm the victim. I'm Julian Vane." Howard stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of perfect, practiced submission. "Officer, thank God you're here. That's my son, Ethan. He's had a complete psychotic break. He's been off his medication for weeks. He's dangerous. He's already attacked 2 people today. Please, be careful with him." "He's lying," Ethan screamed, but 2 officers were already on him. They slammed him onto the hardwood floor, the impact knocking the wind out of him. A knee pressed into the small of his back, and the cold bite of steel handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "Look at the ledger," Ethan pleaded, his face pressed against the dusty floor. "Look at the names. Detective Bennett is in there." The lead officer picked up the ledger. He glanced at Howard, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The officer tucked the book into his belt without looking at a single page. "We'll take it back to the station for processing," the officer said, his voice flat. "Thomas, tell them," Ethan cried out. Thomas Vane tried to step forward, but another officer blocked his path. "Sir, we have a report that you're being held against your will. We need you to stay back while we secure the perimeter." "He's my son," Thomas roared. "Howard Miller kidnapped him 20 years ago." "I understand you're upset, Mr. Vane," Howard said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The trauma of your loss makes you vulnerable to people like Ethan. It's a tragedy, really. We'll get him the help he needs." Ethan watched in horror as Howard and Martha were escorted toward their car. Not as suspects, but as grieving parents. Martha was dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while Howard stood tall, the picture of a man burdened by a difficult duty. "No!" Ethan fought against the officers, but they dragged him toward the door. He saw the tricycle on the porch as they passed, its red paint gleaming in the strobe of the police lights. He was being taken back to the cage, and this time the bars would be made of psychiatric wards and heavy sedation. Howard hadn't just stolen his past. He had successfully stolen his future. Ethan was shoved into the back of a squad car, the interior smelling of stale sweat and industrial cleaner. He watched through the reinforced glass as the Vane estate faded into the rain. He was a ghost again, and the world had finally closed the book on him. He was held in a sterile white room at the precinct, the fluorescent lights flickering in that same jagged, uneven rhythm that made his head throb. He sat on a cold metal bench, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He knew he had minutes before they transferred him to the high-security ward at the state hospital, a place where Howard's influence would ensure he was never heard from again. He looked up at the ceiling. 42? 43. He counted the tiles, his mind racing through the blueprints of the building. He remembered a lecture from his college roommate, David Foster, about the structural flaws in these older civic buildings. "Every structure has a weak point," David had said, smoothing his eyebrows with his thumb. "You just have to find the stress fracture." Ethan looked at the ventilation grate in the corner of the ceiling. It was old, the iron rusted and pitted. He knew that in these 1950s-era precincts, The vents didn't just carry air. They were built around the original structural supports. If he could get to the main shaft, it would lead directly to the service alley. He looked around the room. There, on the small table used for interrogations, was a discarded paperclip. It was a small thing, but to Ethan, it was a master key. He leaned forward, using his teeth to maneuver the metal until he could grip it with his fingers behind his back. He fumbled with the lock on the handcuffs, his fingers numb from the cold. Click, one wrist free, click, the second. He stood on the table, his fingers reaching for the rusted grate. He used the metal edge of the handcuffs to pry at the screws. They groaned, the sound of metal on metal echoing in the small room. Finally, the grate gave way, falling into his hands with a dull thud. He hauled himself into the narrow, dark shaft. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ancient grease. He crawled, his elbows scraping against the metal, counting every inch. Step 10, step 20. He reached a junction where the air felt cooler. He kicked at a secondary grate and it popped open, revealing the rain-slicked pavement of the service alley. He dropped down, his boots hitting the ground with a splash. He was out. But he wasn't finished. He knew where Howard would be. The Millers always stayed at the Fairmont Olympic when they were in Seattle, a place of tradition and excellence, as Howard liked to say. Ethan moved through the shadows, a ghost in the machine of the city. He reached the hotel, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. He didn't go through the lobby. He used the service entrance, blending in with the late-night laundry crew. He reached the 12th floor and found suite 1204. He waited in the shadows of the hallway until he saw Howard and Martha leave for dinner. A healing meal, no doubt, to celebrate their victory. As soon as the elevator doors closed, Ethan moved. He used a plastic strip he'd taken from the laundry room to shim the lock. Inside, the suite was a sea of velvet and mahogany. He went straight for Howard's briefcase, a heavy leather beast sitting on the desk. He felt for the hidden compartment Howard always used for sensitive files. There, tucked behind the lining, was a folder. He opened it. His breath caught. It wasn't just the ledger. It was the original forged birth certificate, the one with the ink still slightly raised. And beneath it, a signed confession, a contingency plan. Howard had written years ago in case Martha ever lost her mind and went to the police. It detailed the kidnapping, the bribery of Detective Bennett, and the systematic erasure of Julian Vane. "I have you," Ethan whispered. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He went to the hotel's business center and used the computer to send an encrypted message to the FBI's regional office, attaching scans of the documents. Then, he went to the dining room. The restaurant was a cathedral of crystal and white linen. Howard and Martha were seated at a corner table, a bottle of expensive champagne chilling in a silver bucket. They looked perfect, the picture of suburban success. Ethan walked toward them, his boots leaving damp prints on the thick carpet. Howard saw him first, his eyes widening, his hand instinctively going to his tie. 1, 2, 3. "Ethan?" Martha gasped, her silver mirror clattering against her plate. "The dinner's over, Howard," Ethan said, his voice ringing out in the quiet room. He pulled the folder from his jacket and laid it on the table, right next to the champagne. "The FBI has the files. They're on their way." "You're bluffing," Howard hissed, though his face had turned the color of ash. "I don't bluff," Ethan said. "Factually speaking, you're a kidnapper, a blackmailer, and a fraud. And for the record, my name is Julian Vane." The doors of the restaurant swung open. 4 men in dark suits moved with military precision toward the table. They didn't look at Ethan. They looked at Howard. Howard Miller, you're under arrest for kidnapping, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. Ethan watched as the handcuffs were placed on Howard's wrists, the same wrists that had held him as a child, the same hands that had built a life out of lies. Martha was led away too, her floral perfume fading as she was escorted out, her mirror left behind on the table, reflecting nothing but the empty chairs. The sun was beginning to rise over the Sound, a pale, watery light that turned the gray clouds to gold. Ethan sat on the porch of the Vane estate, the rhythmic drip-drop of the gutter now a peaceful sound, a ticking clock that finally made sense. Thomas Vane sat next to him, a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked older, his face more lined, but the hardness in his eyes had softened into something resembling peace. "What now?" Thomas asked. Ethan looked out at the city, the movement and light finally feeling like a beginning rather than a threat. He rubbed his index finger against his thumb, scritch, scritch. But the habit felt different now. It wasn't a soothing mechanism. It was a memory. "Now," Ethan said, his voice clear and steady, "I think I'd like to learn how to turn left." He stood up and walked toward the edge of the porch. 1, 2, 3. He didn't stop at 10. He didn't stop at 100. He just kept walking, his feet firm on the ground, his shadow stretching out before him into a future that was finally, undeniably, his own.